In the winter of 1932, a family not far from this hollow butchered a single hog, the only meat animal they had to make that one hog carry them clean through to spring with no ice, no electricity, and no money whatsoever to buy anything to fill in the gaps. They packed most of that hog in coarse salt, layered it into a wooden barrel, and set it in the coolest corner of their cellar. And by every account that survives from families who lived through that exact winter across this whole part of the country, meat packed that way held, it did not rot. It did not sicken anybody who ate it. A family with next to nothing turned one animal into meals that carried them for months on nothing more than salt, patience, and a piece of knowledge that had been passed down mother to daughter and father to son for longer than anybody in that hollow could say for certain. For a great long while afterward, the wider world outside these hills looked at that same barrel of salted pork and saw poverty food, plain and simple, the kind of thing a family ate because they had no better choice, heavy and salty and unrefined, next to whatever a wealthier table might offer. What that wider world did not understand and would not properly understand for a good while longer is that the family packing that barrel had, without a single day of formal schooling in chemistry or biology, solved one of the oldest and most dangerous problems a human being can face, keeping meat safe to eat without the first piece of modern refrigeration, and they had solved it correctly by a method science would eventually confirm works exactly the way those families always believed it did. Poverty gets blamed for a great many things, and in this one particular case, poverty gets credit it does not entirely deserve because the story usually told about salt pork treats it as a sad, plain necessity, the food of people who could not afford anything better. That story misses the actual point almost entirely. Salt pork was not merely a way to make do. It was, and modern food science has since confirmed this plainly, a genuinely correct and effective solution to a genuinely dangerous problem, arrived at generations before anybody understood the microscopic reason it worked. That is the story I'm telling you tonight. Not a myth about a danger that killed careless men, but the honest documented history of how a family with almost nothing solved a problem that, gotten wrong, could kill just as surely as any wolf or any winter storm, and how the plain kitchen chemistry behind that solution held up piece by piece once real scientists finally sat down to study exactly what salt does to meat and why. Here is the twist, and I want you to sit with it before we go any further, because it is the whole spine of what I'm handing you tonight. Salt pork was never simply about flavor, and it was never simply about tradition for its own sake. It was, at its core, a precise and effective piece of preservation chemistry, and the families who made it correctly generation after generation were doing something that took real understanding to get right, even if that understanding lived entirely in careful hands and hard-won family habit rather than in any book. What those families were trying to do has a name that would not exist for a good while yet. It is called controlling water activity, stopping the specific microscopic conditions that spoilage and dangerous bacteria need to grow, and your own great-great-grandmother almost certainly understood, in her hands, if not in those exact words, precisely how to do that correctly. I am going to walk you through every piece of how she did it tonight, honestly, including the mistakes that could turn a barrel of good meat into something genuinely dangerous, because getting this wrong was never a small matter, and getting it right was never merely luck. If you found yourself today needing to preserve meat with nothing but salt, no refrigerator, no freezer, no modern equipment of any kind, most people, without ever having been taught the reasoning behind it, would have only the vaguest sense of what to actually do, salt it somehow, and hope for the best without understanding why some old family methods worked flawlessly for generations, while other, similar sounding shortcuts genuinely poison people. That is the knowing we are digging back up tonight, neighbor. Not a vague nostalgia for a poor family supper, but the actual correct and dangerous to get wrong chemistry that stood behind one of the most important pieces of food knowledge a household could carry. We will get to every bit of it honestly, including exactly where the modern science says the old families were right, and exactly where a modern eye ought to add a bit of caution, the old families could not have known to add. Stay with me, because I intend to give you the full and honest picture rather than a flattering one. I am Ezra Calhoun, and I have spent my whole life on a stretch of Ozark ground. My family has worked for the better part of 200 years, back in a hollow we still call Calhoun Hollow, tucked into the Missouri backcountry, where a barrel of salt pork sat in nearly every cellar of every household for as long as anybody in this family can remember. My grandfather Gideon raised me on that ground, and he was born in 1919 and lived to be 89 years old enough to have grown up eating salt pork as an ordinary, unremarkable part of nearly every meal through some of the hardest years this country's rural families ever faced, and old enough to have learned the actual craft of curing it correctly from his own mother and father before he was much more than a boy himself. Gideon was proud of that knowledge, and he was also characteristically honest about it, telling me plainly more than once that a barrel of salt pork done wrong was not merely unappetizing, it could genuinely make a family sick, and that the difference between a barrel that kept a family fed all winter and a barrel that put them in real danger came down to details he had drilled into his own hands, the same careful, unhurried way he drilled everything worth knowing into mine. By the time we are through here tonight, you will understand exactly what spoilage actually is, at the level of the microscopic organism responsible for it, and exactly why salt, plain ordinary salt, is genuinely effective at stopping it, a piece of real chemistry rather than folk belief. You will know the specific signs, honest and physical, that told an old-timer whether a piece of cured meat was safe to eat or had gone dangerously wrong, signs a careful family checked every single time rather than trusting to hope. You will know the exact mistake, born of a real and understandable frontier pressure, that turned a correctly designed preservation method into a genuinely dangerous one when a family cut the wrong corner. You will know the actual ratios and practices tested and refined across generations that a careful old-timer used to cure meat correctly and reliably. And you will know the last piece, the actual modern science of what salt does to meat at a cellular level, confirming plainly that this old poor family's method was never simply making do, alongside an honest modern caveat about how this same food fits into a healthy diet today, because I promised you honesty tonight, and I intend to give you the whole of it, not merely the flattering half. That is where we are headed tonight, piece by piece, and I am leaving nothing out. There are 6 pieces to understanding how a family with nothing but salt and patience solved one of the oldest problems in human survival, and understanding exactly how to judge, honestly, whether that solution held up under later scientific scrutiny. 6 in order, and the order matters because the danger this whole method was solving has to be understood plainly before the solution itself makes proper sense. The first 2 pieces explain what spoilage actually is and why an incomplete understanding of preservation could genuinely kill a family. The middle pieces cover the honest warning signs of both success and failure and the specific mistake that turned a sound method dangerous. And the 6th piece is the plain modern science, confirming what generations of poor families always believed, while being honest about where a modern eye ought to add its own careful judgment. The first piece is understanding what spoilage actually is at the level of the tiny organisms responsible for it, because this single piece of biology explains why salt pork worked and why getting it wrong could be so dangerous. Fresh meat left at ordinary room temperature is an almost perfect environment for bacteria to multiply, rich in protein, fat, and moisture, and among the organisms capable of growing in improperly stored meat is a particular bacterium responsible for one of the most serious forms of food poisoning known to medicine, a bacterium that produces, under the right conditions, one of the most potent toxins found in nature, capable of causing severe illness and death in genuinely small quantities. This bacterium favors specifically environments low in oxygen, exactly the conditions found deep inside a solid piece of meat or packed tightly in a sealed container, which makes properly preserving meat rather than simply storing it and hoping, a matter of real and serious consequence rather than mere convenience. Here's the piece that connects directly to why salt specifically works to stop this danger, and it comes down to a concept modern food science calls water activity, the measure of how much of the water within a piece of food is actually available for microorganisms to use for their own growth, as opposed to water that is chemically bound up and unavailable to them. Bacteria, including the dangerous one I just described, require a certain minimum level of available water to grow and reproduce at all, and salt, when packed thoroughly into meat, works through a process called osmosis, drawing water out of the meat cells and out of any bacterial cells present through the simple physical tendency of water to move toward a higher concentration of dissolved salt. Done thoroughly and correctly, this process lowers the water activity of the meat below the threshold that dangerous bacteria need to grow at all, effectively starving them of the one resource they cannot do without, regardless of how much protein or fat remains available around them. So the first piece is this, and it runs against a common modern assumption that salt pork was simply meat with salt sprinkled on for taste. It was correctly done an act of precise biological warfare against microscopic organisms that families could not see and did not have the science to name, fought and won, using nothing more than a mineral every household could obtain and a physical process, osmosis, that works exactly the same way whether or not anybody understands the chemistry behind it. It is worth understanding before we go further exactly how significant a substance salt actually was to a frontier household, because that significance shapes almost everything else in tonight's story. Salt was never a casual seasoning a family kept on hand without a second thought the way most modern kitchens treat it today. Inland frontier communities, far from any coastline where seawater could be evaporated for salt directly, depended heavily on natural salt springs and salt licks, mineral-rich water sources bubbling up out of the ground, or on salt hauled overland from established production sites, a genuinely difficult and costly undertaking before good roads and railroads existed. Entire early settlements grew up specifically around productive salt springs because a reliable local salt source was valuable enough to shape where people chose to build their homes and their communities in the first place. A family without convenient access to a salt spring of their own often had to trade valuable goods, furs, grain, or labor for the salt they needed, or travel considerable distances themselves to obtain it, making a barrel of salt a genuine investment of real family resources rather than a minor household expense. This context matters enormously for understanding the pressure I am about to describe in the second piece, because it explains why a family might genuinely be tempted to stretch a limited salt supply further than the tested, proven ratio called for. This was never a case of a family being careless with an abundant, cheap resource. It was a case of a family weighing a real and difficult trade-off between two genuine scarcities, not enough salt and not enough food, and reasonable people under that kind of pressure do not always choose correctly, even when the stakes of that choice are genuinely serious. Here is your first thing to carry out of tonight, and I will give you one at the end of every piece. Salt does not merely season meat. It fundamentally changes the physical environment inside that meat, removing the water that dangerous organisms require, and understanding that fact is the difference between treating salt curing as a vague old tradition and understanding it as the genuinely effective piece of food science it actually is. Now, if salt genuinely does this work so effectively, why was getting the process wrong such a real and documented danger rather than a foolproof method no family could ever fail at? This brings me to the second piece, and it explains exactly where the margin for error in this whole method actually sat. The second piece is understanding that this method only works when it is done thoroughly and completely, and the danger sat precisely in the gap between a family that understood this and a family that treated salt curing as a rough approximation rather than a precise process. Salt has to actually penetrate all the way through a piece of meat, reaching every portion of it in sufficient concentration in order to lower the water activity throughout the entire piece rather than merely on its outer surface. A large, thick cut of meat, salted only lightly or salted only on its outside without sufficient time and sufficient salt concentration to work its way fully through, can end up with a surface that appears properly cured while the deep interior remains at a water activity level still hospitable to dangerous bacterial growth, a condition that gives no obvious outward sign to a family relying on appearance alone. This is precisely why traditional salt curing recipes, refined across countless generations of trial and genuinely fatal error, specified particular cuts of meat, particular thicknesses, particular salt ratios, and particular lengths of curing time, because those specific numbers represented the accumulated hard-won knowledge of exactly how long it actually takes salt to penetrate meat of a given size thoroughly enough to be trusted. This is the trap that a family in a hurry or a family trying to stretch a limited supply of salt across more meat than it could properly cure could fall into without any obvious warning at the time. A piece of meat that looked, felt, and smelled perfectly ordinary on the day it went into the salt could weeks later still harbor a dangerously undercured interior if the original process had cut corners on time, salt quantity, or the size of the cut being cured, and the family eating that meat would have no way to know, simply by looking at it, that the preservation process had not actually finished its job all the way through. Here is your second thing to carry. Salt curing is not a rough approximation that works reasonably well, however it is done. It is a precise process with real margins that either succeed completely or fail in a way that gives no obvious outward warning, which is exactly why the old families who did this correctly followed specific tested ratios and times rather than trusting to instinct alone, and exactly why the honest signs I'm about to walk you through mattered so much to a family checking their own barrel before they ever trusted a piece of it to their supper table. Gideon told me a story once about a family 2 hollows over from his own boyhood home that illustrates exactly this danger in plain human terms. That family, in a hard year when their own hog had come in smaller than usual and their salt supply had not stretched to match it, cured a set of hams that looked by every outward appearance perfectly ordinary. The same color, the same firmness at the surface, the same general smell any properly cured ham would carry. Weeks into that winter, deep inside one of those hams, in a portion the salt had never fully reached, spoilage had quietly taken hold, hidden entirely from view beneath a surface that told the family nothing was wrong. Gideon's own account of what followed was not detailed enough for me to say precisely what illness struck that household, only that it struck hard, that more than one member of that family took genuinely and seriously ill, and that word of it spread through the surrounding hollows fast enough that his own mother sat him down not long after and walked him, step by step, through exactly why a family must never guess at their salt ratio, why a barrel salted a little light. To stretch a short supply was a barrel that could not be trusted, no matter how ordinary it looked or smelled at first glance. That story, secondhand and imperfectly remembered as it reached me across 3 generations, was enough to make certain I never once, in my own kitchen, treated a curing ratio as a rough suggestion rather than a genuine boundary. It is worth pausing on why this particular danger proved so difficult for families to guard against on their own, without any outside authority checking their work. A family curing meat correctly year after year built up a real and justified confidence in their own method, and that confidence, entirely earned through genuine success, made it all the harder to recognize the one-year circumstances forced a shortcut that quietly broke the very process that confidence rested on. This is precisely why the specific checks I'm about to walk you through in the third piece mattered so much, because a family's general confidence in their own skill was never by itself a reliable substitute for checking each individual piece of meat honestly every single time, regardless of how many barrels that same family had cured successfully before. A careful old-timer checked before ever trusting cured meat to be safe, because these signs, learned and trusted across generations, gave a family real information even without any laboratory to confirm what their own senses were telling them. The first check was texture, felt directly with the hand, Properly cured meat, salt having done its work thoroughly, develops a firm, dense feel throughout, resistant to the touch in a way fresh, uncured meat is not, and any portion of a cured piece that still felt soft, spongy, or notably softer than the rest of the same cut was treated as a genuine warning sign, evidence that the salt had not fully penetrated and done its complete work in that particular spot. The second check was smell, and this one carried real, trustworthy information because properly cured meat carries a clean, distinctly salty smell, sharp but not unpleasant, while meat where spoilage organisms have gained any real foothold develops an unmistakably sour, sometimes faintly sulfurous or ammonia-like odor that a careful nose learns to recognize immediately and completely distrusts the moment it appears, regardless of how the meat happens to look. The old rule on this point was absolute and admitted no exceptions. Any hint of a sour or off smell meant that piece of meat was discarded entirely, full stop, because the potential consequences of guessing wrong on this particular point were far too severe to risk on hope alone. The third check was color and surface condition, a properly cured piece maintaining a consistent, even color throughout, without patches of unusual graying, without any slick or slimy surface film developing, and without the faint iridescent or rainbow-like sheen that can sometimes appear on the surface of meat where bacterial activity has begun, a visual sign old-timers learned to catch quickly precisely because by the time it became obvious, real spoilage was often already well underway. Here is the rule, and it is 3 lines, the same shape as always. 1. Any portion of cured meat that feels notably softer or less firm than the rest of the piece is a sign the cure did not fully penetrate that spot, and it should never be trusted regardless of how the rest of the piece appears. 2. Any sour, ammonia-like, or otherwise off smell, however faint, means immediate and complete rejection of that piece, with no exceptions and no attempt to salvage any part of it by trimming away the affected portion alone. 3. Any unusual graying, slime, or iridescent sheen on the surface is a visual confirmation that spoilage organisms have already gained a foothold, and it should be treated with exactly the same absolute rejection as a bad smell. Firm texture, clean smell, consistent color, in that order, and a careful old-timer checked every single one of them, every single time, before ever trusting a piece of cured meat to feed their own family. Gideon told me his own mother would not allow a single piece of meat from that cellar barrel onto her table without running her own hands and her own nose over it first, every single time, regardless of how many times that exact barrel had already proven itself safe on previous occasions because she understood in her own hard-earned way that one piece of meat curing imperfectly did not mean the whole barrel had failed, and that trusting the barrel as a whole rather than checking each piece individually was exactly the kind of shortcut that could cost a family dearly. I have carried that same habit forward into my own kitchen, checking any cured meat I prepare with my own hands and my own nose before it ever reaches my own table, not out of excessive caution, but out of the same plain respect Gideon's mother held for a process that, done correctly, was entirely safe and done carelessly, genuinely was not. So there is your third thing to carry. Learn the 3 checks, firm texture throughout, a clean rather than sour smell, and a consistent color without slime or unusual sheen, and treat every single one of them as non-negotiable every time, regardless of how trustworthy a particular batch has proven in the past. Now here is where I have to break the pattern of this story for a moment, friend, because everything I have told you so far, the biology of spoilage, the precision the process actually requires, and the honest physical checks that confirm success or failure, is knowledge that careful old-time families carried in their hands and their senses, even without the laboratory science to explain exactly why it worked. What comes next is the specific, understandable mistake that turned this sound and effective method into a genuinely dangerous one, and it grew directly out of the real economic pressure those families were living under. The fourth piece is the false fix, and it describes a mistake that grew directly out of a real and understandable frontier pressure rather than simple carelessness, because salt itself, for most of this country's early history, was neither cheap nor always easy to obtain. Salt had to be mined, evaporated from brine springs, or hauled a considerable distance to reach an inland frontier household, and it carried real costs, sometimes serious costs, to a family with very little money to spare. This created a genuine and understandable temptation when a family had more meat to preserve than their available salt supply could properly handle by the full correct ratio to stretch that limited salt further than it ought to have been stretched, using slightly less than the tested and proven amount across a larger quantity of meat, in the hope that a lighter application would still do the job well enough to get by. This is the false fix, and it is a particularly dangerous one precisely because a lightly salted piece of meat can look in the earliest days after curing almost identical to a properly salted one, giving a family no immediate warning that they have compromised the very process meant to keep them safe. The consequences of that shortcut, when they did appear, often did not show up until weeks later, deep into winter, when the family most needed that meat to be reliable and had the least ability to simply discard it and start over. A family that stretched their salt too thin was not being reckless in any ordinary sense. They were responding entirely reasonably to a real scarcity of an expensive and necessary resource and making a judgment call under genuine economic pressure that unfortunately this particular process did not forgive. Here is your fourth thing to carry, and it applies to a great deal more than salt curing alone. When a proven process specifies a particular ratio or quantity for a genuine safety reason, stretching that ratio to save money or materials is not a small, harmless economy. It is removing the actual margin of safety the process was designed around, and the true cost of that shortcut, when it appears at all, very often appears at the worst possible moment when a family or a person is least equipped to absorb it. The old-timers who came through hard winters safely were overwhelmingly the ones who found some other way to economize, working harder to gather or trade for enough salt, rather than the ones who quietly thinned out the one ingredient standing between their family and real danger. Now, having covered the danger of undersalting, what did the families who consistently got this right actually do in specific practical terms to make certain their own cure was thorough every single time? That is the fifth piece, and it is the piece of hands-on craft this whole lesson has been building toward. The fifth piece is the actual practical method careful families use to cure meat correctly and reliably, refined across generations of hard-won experience, and it comes down to a specific process rather than a rough general habit. Start with the cut itself. Families cured smaller, thinner pieces of meat far more readily and reliably than large, thick ones, specifically because salt needs real time to fully penetrate meat, and a thinner piece allows that penetration to reach the center in a length of time a family can reasonably plan around, while a thick, large cut may require weeks of careful curing to be trusted all the way through, if it can be trusted safely at all without cutting it down first. Second, careful families used a measured, tested ratio of salt to meat by weight, applying it thoroughly and evenly across every surface of the cut rather than a rough sprinkle, packing coarse salt firmly against every inch of the meat's surface into every crevice and fold, because a single missed patch of surface left without direct salt contact represented a genuine weak point where the cure might fail to penetrate fully. Third, where families used a brine solution rather than a dry pack, they relied on a simple physical test that required no scale or measuring device at all, floating a clean raw egg in the brine and adjusting the salt concentration until the egg floated with a small portion showing above the surface. A rough but genuinely effective way of confirming the brine had reached a salt concentration strong enough to do its job, because a properly salt-saturated brine is dense enough to float an egg that would otherwise sink in plain water. Fourth, careful families held their curing meat at a genuinely cool, stable temperature throughout the entire curing period, understanding, even without the biology to fully explain why, that warmth accelerated the very spoilage organisms the salt was working to defeat, and that a curing process taking place in a warm, fluctuating environment was racing against the clock. The cold cellar corner simply did not have to worry about nearly as much. And fifth, families turned and repacked their curing meat periodically throughout the process, ensuring that salt in contact with one surface did not simply sit static, while another surface went comparatively neglected, redistributing the salt and the developing brine evenly across every piece in the barrel rather than trusting the process to sort itself out on its own. There is a sixth practice worth adding to this list, one many families layered on top of salt curing rather than relying on, though it never replaced the salt itself as the actual work of preservation. A number of households, once meat had been properly salt cured, hung that meat afterward in a smokehouse over a low, steady fire of hardwood coals. And I want to be precise and honest about exactly what that smoking step was and was not accomplishing, because it is a point often misunderstood even by people who grew up around the practice. Smoke itself carries certain compounds with a modest antimicrobial effect on the surface of meat, and it does contribute some real, if limited, additional protection, particularly against mold and surface bacteria. But the smoking process was never doing the primary work of preservation in the way the salt itself was. Salt, drawing water out of the meat through osmosis and lowering its water activity throughout the entire piece, was always the genuine engine of safety in this whole method. Smoke added flavor, added a modest additional layer of surface protection, and helped further dry the outer portion of the meat. But a family who smoked meat that had not first been properly and thoroughly salted was not protected by that smoke alone, and old-timers who understood the process correctly never treated smoking as a substitute for a proper cure, only as a worthwhile addition layered on top of one. Families who did add this step generally used only hardwood, oak, hickory, or fruit woods, being especially favored, and specifically avoided resinous softwoods like pine, understanding, even without a chemist's vocabulary for it, that the smoke and sap from those softer woods carried an unpleasant, sometimes genuinely unhealthy character entirely unlike the clean smoke of a proper hardwood fire. The smoking itself took place over a period of days rather than hours at a low, carefully tended temperature, close attention paid to keeping the fire smoldering rather than flaming, because a fire allowed to burn too hot risked cooking the meat's surface rather than slowly curing and flavoring it, changing both its texture and its ability to keep well over the following months. Cut meat into pieces thin enough for salt to fully penetrate within a reasonable and trusted time frame. Apply a measured, tested salt ratio thoroughly across every surface, packing firmly into every crevice rather than a light sprinkle. Use the egg float test to confirm proper brine strength where a brine method is used. Hold curing meat at a genuinely cool, stable temperature throughout the process, and turn and repack the meat periodically to ensure even salt distribution across every piece. That is the full craft, tested across generations and refined by exactly the kind of hard experience no family wanted to repeat twice. Now, here is another pattern break, friend, because we are at the edge of the last piece, and I want you square with me before we step over it. Everything so far, the biology of spoilage, the precision the process demands, the honest checks for success and failure, the false fix of undersalting, and the specific hands-on craft that got this right. Generations of careful families carried forward through hard experience alone. What comes next is the plain modern science confirming all of it, and the honest, balanced word I promised you about how this old poor family's food fits into how we think about eating today. The sixth piece, the last piece, is the actual modern science behind salt curing, and once you understand it plainly, you will see exactly why food scientists studying this old method eventually confirmed in careful laboratory terms precisely what generations of poor rural families always believed through hard experience alone. The concept of water activity I described earlier was not properly formalized and measured by food science until well into the 20th century, decades and in many cases well over a century after families like the ones I have described tonight were already practicing salt curing correctly, purely through inherited technique and careful attention to the physical signs I walked you through in the third piece. When modern researchers finally sat down and measured exactly what happens inside a properly salted piece of meat, they confirmed that traditional dry curing and brining methods, done according to the ratios and time frames refined by generations of practical experience, do indeed lower water activity below the threshold required to prevent the growth of dangerous bacteria, including the specific organism responsible for the most serious risk I described in the first piece. This is not a case of modern science discovering the old method was accidentally safe. It is a case of modern science explaining in precise chemical terms exactly why a method poor rural families had already perfected through generations of careful, hard-won trial and error actually worked. Now, here is the honest, balanced word I promised you, because I do not want to leave you with the impression that salt pork deserves an uncritical modern endorsement as an everyday food, and I would not be giving you the full truth if I let that impression stand. The very same salt that makes this preservation method work is a food component. Modern medical science has real, legitimate reason to encourage moderation around because a diet consistently high in sodium is genuinely linked to elevated blood pressure and related cardiovascular concerns for a great many people, a fact modern nutrition science has documented thoroughly and that deserves honest respect rather than dismissal. Beyond the sodium question, health researchers have also raised genuine documented concerns about the broader category of heavily salted and cured meats when consumed frequently as a large part of a regular modern diet, concerns significant enough that international health bodies have formally weighed in on the subject in the past decade. None of this means salt pork is dangerous food, and none of it erases the genuine chemical brilliance of the preservation method itself. It means that the specific genius those old families deserve real credit for was solving an urgent, immediate, and genuinely life-threatening problem, keeping meats safe from deadly spoilage with no refrigeration available to them at all, not necessarily providing a template for how a modern person, with a refrigerator sitting in their own kitchen and far more food security than those families ever had, ought to eat every single day of the year. So that is the sixth piece, the honest heart of the whole thing. Salt curing works precisely the way generations of poor rural families always believed it did, drawing water out of meat through simple physical osmosis and starving dangerous bacteria of the moisture they need to grow, a genuine and effective piece of food chemistry those families discovered and refined through nothing more than careful, patient attention long before any laboratory existed to explain why it worked. That is real, documented, and thoroughly deserved credit, and I do not want you to leave here tonight thinking otherwise. And a modern person choosing to enjoy that same food today does well to enjoy it, as the old families largely did, as a meaningful but not unlimited part of a broader diet, rather than assuming that scientific vindication of the preservation chemistry means the food itself carries no modern dietary considerations worth a second thought. There is one more thought worth leaving you with before I close out tonight, because it reaches a little beyond salt pork itself and touches something Gideon believed applied to a great deal more of life than a single cellar barrel. He used to say that the families who came through hard years intact were rarely the boldest or the luckiest. They were, almost without exception, the ones who respected a proven process enough to follow it completely, even when following it completely cost them something real in the moment. A little more salt than they wished to spend, a little more patience than they wished to exercise, a little more careful checking than felt strictly necessary on a barrel that had never once failed them before. That respect for a tested process more than any single ingredient or technique is very likely the true thread running through nearly everything this family passed down across 200 years on this same stretch of ground, and it is worth carrying into a great deal more than how you might someday cure a piece of meat. Because the family in that opening story was never simply making do with less. They were solving a genuinely dangerous problem correctly, using knowledge passed down with real care and real precision, and getting it right made the difference between a family fed safely through a hard winter and a family that might not have survived one wrong shortcut with their own salt supply. If you ever find yourself curing meat with nothing but salt and patience, you will not simply salt it and hope. You will understand why the process works, you will check it honestly with your own hands and your own nose, and you will respect the ratios and the time the old family spent generations working out, rather than assuming any rough approximation will do. That is not fear talk, and it is not doom talk. That is the same plain, honest, hard-earned respect Gideon's own mother carried into her own cellar every single winter of her life. Respect for a piece of knowledge that deserved to be taken seriously, precisely because getting it wrong carried real consequences, and getting it right, as science has since confirmed, was never merely making do. It was genuine skill, earned the hard way, long before anybody had a laboratory to prove it. Done by hand, told straight.